You know, there's a moment that happens to many of us at some point in our lives. It's not loud, it's not dramatic. In fact, most of the time, it happens in a very ordinary setting: a living room, a dinner table, a family gathering where everyone feels comfortable enough to say what's on their mind. And suddenly, without warning, you realize something important. You realize that the people around you, the ones who love you the most, have quietly been planning your life. Not in a controlling way, not with bad intentions, but in the way families often do, through expectations, assumptions, traditions, through the belief that there is a certain path that leads to happiness, and if they guide you toward that path, they are doing the right thing. For a long time, I never questioned it. I grew up in a home where success had a clear shape. You study hard, you build a career, you find a partner, you settle down, you build a family, you create stability. And if you follow those steps in roughly the right order, life will reward you with happiness. At least that's the idea many of us inherit. And for years, I moved through life believing that was the natural rhythm of things, not because anyone forced it on me, but because it was simply the story everyone seemed to agree on. A few years ago, I went home to visit my family for a Sunday gathering. Nothing special, just one of those slow afternoons where the house fills with relatives, laughter drifts through the rooms, and the kitchen becomes the heart of everything. Someone is always talking. Someone is always telling a story. Plates move around the table. People interrupt each other mid-sentence. It's warm, familiar, comforting. You feel surrounded by history in those moments. And for the first hour or so, everything was exactly like that. Easy conversation, questions about work, stories about travel. Someone teasing me about how often I seem to be on a plane these days. I was enjoying it, truly. But then the conversation took a very familiar turn. It started gently. An aunt leaned across the table and asked almost playfully, "So, when are we going to attend your wedding?" Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because questions like that aren't unusual in families, especially when you reach a certain age. But then another voice joined the conversation. "Well," someone said, "she's almost 30 now." Another person chimed in, "She has a good career, she travels, she's stable. Now she just needs to settle down." And suddenly, the table had become a small committee discussing the future of my life. What struck me most wasn't the question itself, it was the certainty behind it. People were speaking as if the next chapter of my life had already been written, and I simply needed to catch up with it. Someone mentioned how quickly time moves. Someone else talked about the importance of not waiting too long to start a family. Another person joked that I should let them help find me a suitable partner. The suggestions kept coming, light-hearted but persistent, and I sat there listening, smiling politely, nodding occasionally, doing what many of us do in those situations. But inside, something quiet was happening. I began to notice something I had never paid attention to before. No one at that table was asking what I wanted. They weren't curious about the kind of life I imagined for myself. They were simply assuming that the life they believed in was the life I should be moving toward. And again, I want to be clear about something. They weren't trying to control me. They were expressing love in the language they understood. But in that moment, I felt a strange sense of distance, almost like I had stepped outside the conversation and was watching it from the corner of the room. It was as if everyone had gathered around a blueprint, discussing the structure of a house they believed I should live in. Except, I wasn't sure that house belonged to me. For a long time, I stayed quiet. Partly because I didn't want to create tension, partly because I respected their opinions, and partly Because I realized something uncomfortable. I had never actually told them what I wanted either. I had allowed assumptions to exist simply because it felt easier than explaining myself. But that afternoon, one sentence changed everything. Someone said very confidently, "Don't worry, she'll figure it out soon. Everyone eventually does." And in that moment, something inside me shifted, because I realized they believed I was behind schedule in a life I had never agreed to follow. I looked around the table at people I loved deeply, people who had supported me through so many stages of my life, and I understood something important. Every one of them carried their own version of what happiness looked like. For some, happiness meant building a family early. For others, it meant stability and tradition. For someone else, it meant following the same path that had worked for them. And they were offering me those ideas, like gifts. But not every gift is meant to be accepted. That realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it made me more compassionate, because I understood that expectations often come from love, mixed with fear. The people who care about us want reassurance that we will be safe, secure, fulfilled. And sometimes the only way they know how to imagine that future is through the path they already understand. But life is rarely that simple, and happiness rarely follows a strict timeline. So I took a small breath, and I decided to say something I had never said out loud before. Not dramatically, not confrontationally, just honestly. I leaned forward slightly and said, "I know everyone means well, but I'm actually really happy with the life I'm building right now." The table became quiet. Not uncomfortably quiet, just the kind of pause where people realize the conversation has shifted in a direction they didn't expect. I continued, "I'm not against marriage or family. Those things are beautiful. But I don't want to step into that life simply because it's expected at a certain age. I want it to happen when it genuinely feels right." For a few seconds, no one said anything, and I could see that some people were surprised, not because what I said was rebellious, but because it was different from the narrative they had been imagining for me. Eventually, someone nodded slowly. Another person smiled, and the conversation moved on. But something had quietly changed. That moment didn't create conflict, it created clarity. Because for the first time, the people around me understood that my life might unfold differently than they expected, and that I was okay with that. And more importantly, I was okay with that too. You see, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is not fight expectations aggressively, but simply speak our truth calmly. Because calm honesty has a way of resetting the conversation. After that day, I noticed something interesting. The questions didn't completely disappear. Families will always be curious. But the tone changed. There was less pressure and more understanding. And I think that happened because I finally allowed people to see the life I was actually living, instead of the one they were imagining for me. And if there's one thing that experience taught me, it's this. You can love your family deeply and still choose a different path. Those two things are not in conflict. In fact, the healthiest relationships often grow stronger when honesty enters the room, because pretending to live someone else's dream eventually becomes exhausting, and life is far too short for that. The truth is, our lives don't need to follow the same timeline as everyone around us. Some people build families early. Some people explore the world first. Some people change careers at 40. Some people discover entirely new versions of themselves later in life. And all of those paths are valid. What matters most is that the life you're building actually feels like yours, not like a performance for other people's expectations. So now I'm curious about you. Have you ever experienced a moment when the people around you had a very clear vision for your life, but deep down you felt called towards something different? Maybe you followed your own path. Maybe you're still figuring it out. Or maybe you're standing right at that crossroads right now.
If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. Conversations like this remind us that we're not alone in navigating these quiet turning points in life. And if you enjoy these kinds of calm, reflective conversations, stories about life, choices, and the lessons we discover along the way shared right here in the kitchen, then I warmly invite you to subscribe to the GistOver Cooking channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and always something gently cooking in the background. Until next time, take your time with life. And remember, you are allowed to build a life that feels true to you.